Station security had 3 rules about dangerous passengers: scan them, catalog them, and contain them before they could cause problems. What they didn't have rules for was passengers who made every living thing within 50 meters suddenly develop an urgent need to be somewhere else. The Galactic Peace Station was supposed to be the crown jewel of interstellar diplomacy, 300 kilometers of gleaming metal and carefully negotiated neutrality, floating in the void like a monument to the galaxy's ability to not immediately blow itself up. Home to over 2 million beings from 46 different species, it was where civilizations came to argue about trade routes and mining rights without resorting to planet crackers and stellar genocide. At least, that was the theory. Elsa Thorne stepped off the transport shuttle with the casual confidence of someone who'd been dealing with galactic politics since before she could properly pronounce xenophobia. At 28, she looked like every other mid-level diplomatic aide in the galaxy. Professional pantsuit, sensible shoes, and the kind of polite smile that suggested she'd rather be literally anywhere else. Her credentials read Junior Attaché, Human Colonial Administration, which was about as exciting as it sounded. What her credentials didn't mention were the shadows. They followed her down the docking tube like obedient pets, dark shapes that seemed to exist just outside peripheral vision. Not quite there when you looked directly at them, but definitely, absolutely present when you weren't paying attention. They moved with liquid grace, flowing around corners and slipping through spaces that shouldn't have been big enough for anything larger than a dust mote. The Beltarian customs officer barely glanced at Elsa's papers. Beltarians were tall, blue, and perpetually looked like they'd just smelled something unpleasant, which, given their enhanced olfactory systems, they probably had. This one, however, kept twitching his head to the left, as if something in his peripheral vision was bothering him. "Purpose of visit?" he asked, in that nasal Beltarian accent that made everything sound like a complaint. "Trade negotiations with the Antaran Collective," Elsa replied cheerfully. "Thrilling stuff. Really gets the blood pumping." The customs officer's eyes flicked to the space just behind her shoulder, then snapped back to her face. His nostrils flared, which, for a Beltarian, was never a good sign. "Are you traveling alone?" Elsa's smile didn't waver. "Unless you count my sparkling personality and devastating wit." Behind her, something that definitely wasn't her shadow rippled. The customs officer stared at the space over her head for a long moment, his blue skin taking on a slightly green tinge. "Right. Welcome to Galactic Peace Station. Try not to contaminate anything." "I'll do my best," Elsa said, already walking away. The shadows flowed with her, completely invisible to the security. Cameras, but apparently not to anyone with decent peripheral vision and a functioning nervous system. By the time she'd made it 3 levels into the station, word was already spreading through the security network. Gorth, the station's chief security officer, was the kind of Beltarian who joined law enforcement because it gave him a legitimate excuse for his paranoia. He stood in the security center, surrounded by holographic displays showing every corridor, every life sign, every atmospheric reading on the station. "Run it again," he barked at his subordinate, a nervous Turellian whose tentacles kept changing colors. The security footage played back in slow motion. Elsa walking down corridor C-15. Alone. Completely, utterly alone. Except for the way other beings kept stepping aside without seeming to realize they were doing it. Except for the way small objects, loose papers, drinking cups, atmospheric condensation, moved in patterns that suggested something substantial was passing by them. "Sensor readings," Gorth demanded. "Negative, sir. No additional life signs. No energy signatures. No mass displacement. According to every scanner we have, she's traveling alone." "Then explain," Gorth said, his voice rising to that particularly unpleasant frequency that made nearby glass vibrate. "Why every being with functioning instincts is unconsciously avoiding her personal space by exactly 2 meters. The Turellian's tentacles shifted to a lovely shade of, "I really don't want to answer that question." "Unknown, sir." 3 levels up, Elsa was making friends. Or at least she was making conversation with beings who were too polite to point out that standing near her made their fight-or-flight responses go absolutely haywire. "Oh, you're from the Rigel system," she said to a crystalline silicoid diplomat whose geometric form was vibrating at a frequency that suggested barely contained panic. "I've always wanted to visit. I hear the Aurora displays there are absolutely killer." The silicoid's crystalline structure flickered. Yes, quite lethal, actually. If you'll excuse me, I have urgent geometric meditations to attend to. He practically fled, his crystal feet clicking against the deck plating like castanets played by someone having a seizure. Friendly fellow, Elsa murmured to herself, or perhaps to the empty air beside her, which, coincidentally, seemed to ripple with what might have been amusement. By the time she'd checked into her quarters, a modest two-room suite in the diplomatic quarter, half the station's non-human population was experiencing what the medical bay would later classify as acute anxiety of unknown origin. The other half was busy pretending they hadn't noticed anything unusual while quietly updating their wills. Gorth, meanwhile, was doing what Beltarians did best, working himself into a state of suspicious frenzy. I want full biological scans, he announced to his security team. I want atmospheric analysis. I want to know what she had for breakfast and whether it's contagious. Sir, ventured his deputy, a methodical centaurian whose species was known for their logical approach to problems, perhaps we're overreacting. Many humans have unusual presences. It's documented that their species has a tendency to make other beings feel unsettled. Unsettled? Gorth's voice climbed another octave. The Chithari Prime Minister locked herself in her chambers and is demanding we fumigate the entire diplomatic quarter. The Scales ambassador is convinced we're under attack by invisible predators, and that new trade representative from the Helix Confederation asked to be transferred to a different station, preferably in a different galaxy. The Centaurian's antennae twitched, their species equivalent of a shrug. Humans can be intense. This isn't intensity, Gorth snarled. This is something else entirely, and I'm going to find out what. In her quarters, Elsa was unpacking with the sort of casual efficiency that came from a lifetime of diplomatic travel. Her belongings were unremarkable: clothing, personal hygiene items, a small potted plant that had somehow survived customs, and a collection of data pads containing trade agreements that were mind-numbing in their tedium. What was remarkable was how the shadows moved independently of any light source, occasionally reaching out to help steady her luggage or adjust the temperature controls without being asked. You're being a bit obvious, she murmured, while hanging up her formal diplomatic dress. I appreciate the help, but we're trying to keep a low profile, remember? The air in front of her seemed to shimmer with something that might have been sheepishness. I know. New place, new smells, new potential threats to assess. But try to dial it back a notch, okay? We haven't even made it to the first meeting yet. A soft sound, barely audible, that could have been a purr, or perhaps the gentle hum of air recycling systems. Except the air recycling systems didn't typically respond to being scratched behind what might generously be called ears. 3 hours later, Gorth made his move. He arrived at Elsa's quarters with a full security detail. 4 Beltarians, 2 Centaurians, and a Tyrellian whose tentacles had been stuck on nervous yellow since the morning briefing. They were armed with every scanner, detector, and analytical device the station's science department had been able to provide on short notice. The door chimed. Elsa opened it with the sort of professional smile that suggested she'd been expecting this visit since the moment she'd stepped off the transport. Gentlemen, she said pleasantly. And lady, she added, nodding to the female Centaurian. Something I can help you with? Gorth's eyes darted past her into the quarters, where absolutely nothing unusual was visible, which somehow made everything feel significantly more unusual. Routine security inspection, Hitai announced, though his voice suggested it was anything but routine. We've had reports of anomalous readings in this section. How exciting, Elsa said, stepping aside to let them enter. Please, come in. Can I offer anyone refreshments? I've got genuine Earth coffee, though I should warn you it's probably strong enough to strip paint. The security team filed into her quarters, sensors sweeping, scanners humming, detectors detecting absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. Gorth watched their readings with growing frustration as every device confirmed what the security feeds had already told them. Elsa Thorne was completely, utterly, and thoroughly alone. Except the Tyrellian refused to enter the main living area, his tentacles now cycling through colors that didn't exist in any known spectrum of fear. Except the Centaurian's logical demeanor cracked just enough for her to keep glancing over her shoulder. Except Gorth himself kept feeling like something large, predatory, and personally offended by his presence was breathing down his neck. "Everything seems to be in order," the lead Centaurian reported, though her voice had a slight tremor that suggested her definition of order was being severely tested. "Wonderful," Elsa said. "I'd hate to think I was causing any trouble." Gorth stared at her for a long moment. She looked back with the kind of innocent expression that suggested she had absolutely no idea why everyone on the station was having anxiety attacks in her presence. "Ms. Thorne," he said carefully, "is there anything you'd like to tell us? Anything unusual? About your background or current circumstances?" "Unusual?" Elsa's eyebrows rose. "I'm afraid I don't follow. I'm a junior trade attaché specializing in agricultural export agreements. I grow prize-winning tomatoes in my spare time, and I have a cat named Mr. Whiskers back home. If that's unusual, then guilty as charged." One of the Beltarian security officers made a sound that was half laugh, half nervous breakdown. "What my colleague means," Gorth pressed on, his voice taking on the particular tone of someone who knew he was being lied to but couldn't prove it, "is whether you're traveling with anything that might not show up on our sensors." Elsa's smile didn't waver, but something in her eyes shifted. For just a moment, Gorth glimpsed something that made his enhanced Beltarian instincts scream warnings about apex predators and the food chain. "Oh," she said lightly. "You mean my friends?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The security team's instruments began registering readings that shouldn't have been possible. Energy signatures that existed in spectrums that hadn't been classified yet. Gravitational anomalies that suggested mass without substance, and electromagnetic fluctuations that made absolutely no sense according to any known physics. "Your friends?" Gorth managed. "They're not following me," Elsa said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something very simple to someone very slow. "They're protecting me." And then, for just a moment, the shadows in the room moved independently of any light source, and the security team got their first real glimpse of what had been making them so fundamentally, instinctively terrified. They were beautiful, in the way that black holes were beautiful, in the way that perfect storms were beautiful, in the way that things that could end civilizations without breaking a sweat were beautiful. The security team's instruments went haywire. Alarms began sounding throughout the station, and somewhere in the depths of space, something vast and hostile detected the energy signature of interdimensional predators and began changing course toward the Galactic Peace Station. But Elsa just smiled and asked if anyone wanted that coffee. The holding cell was designed to contain beings who could manipulate gravity, phase through solid matter, or secrete acids that could dissolve starship hulls. What it wasn't designed for was a human woman who sat cross-legged on the bench, calmly braiding her hair while surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. "This is highly irregular," announced the Chitauri Prime Minister, her insectoid form clicking and whirring with agitation. She stood well outside the containment field, as far from the cell as the room would allow, but even that wasn't nearly far enough for her comfort. That human has brought parasites aboard this station." Gorth stared through the transparent aluminum at Elsa, who looked up from her braiding and waved cheerfully. Behind her, or perhaps around her, or possibly occupying the same space through some violation of basic physics, shadows moved with purposeful intelligence. "They're not parasites," Elsa called out, her voice carrying easily through the containment field's audio pickups. "Honestly, you people have no imagination. Just because you can't categorize something doesn't make it automatically hostile." The Scales ambassador, all 2 meters of reptilian dignity, hissed softly. "Then what, precisely, are they?" "Old friends," Elsa said, as if that explained anything. Gorth's patience, already stretched thinner than the hull plating on a discount freighter, finally snapped. "Ms. Thorne, this station is home to over 2 million beings from 46 species. Since your arrival 6 hours ago, we've had 328 reports of unexplained anxiety, 41 requests for immediate transfer to other facilities, and 17 beings who've barricaded themselves in their quarters. The Helix Trade Delegation has threatened to declare war on any species that harbors a shadow demons. And the Antaran Collective is demanding we jettison the entire diplomatic quarter into space. So perhaps you could be more specific about these old friends of yours." Elsa tilted her head, considering. Around her, the shadows rippled with what might have been amusement. "You want the long version or the short version?" "I want the version that doesn't end with me explaining to the Galactic Council why their peace station had to be evacuated," Gorth snapped. "Fair enough." Elsa stood up, brushing dust off her pantsuit. "Short version, I'm from Haven's Rest, which you probably haven't heard of because it's not on any official star charts. We had some unusual neighbors. Turns out, when you treat interdimensional apex predators with basic courtesy instead of screaming and shooting at them, they remember that. These particular individuals decided they liked humans enough to stick around." The room fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the faint clicking of the Chitauri Prime Minister's anxiety response. "Interdimensional apex predators," the Scales ambassador repeated slowly. "The technical term is void hunters," Elsa said helpfully, "though I just call them the Pack. They've been with me since I was 8. "Void hunters." Gorth's voice had taken on the hollow quality of someone whose worldview was undergoing rapid and unwelcome reconstruction. "You're telling me you have void hunters as pets?" "Pets?" Elsa's laugh had an edge to it that made everyone in the room take an involuntary step backward. "Oh, that's rich." "No, Chief Gorth, they're not pets. They're family. There's a difference." One of the shadows behind her seemed to grow larger, more substantial. For just a moment, the outline of something massive and predatory was visible. Sleek lines, too many teeth, and eyes like burning stars in empty space. The Chitauri Prime Minister made a sound that was probably screaming in her species' ultrasonic range. "You see," Elsa continued conversationally, "most species in this galaxy have a very simple relationship with void hunters. They run, hide, and prey. The hunters get bored and go eat someone else's civilization. But humans, we're stubborn that way. When something tries to eat us, we tend to take it personally." Through the containment field, her eyes met Gorth's, and he saw something there that made his Beltarian instincts gibber in terror. Not madness, exactly, but the kind of calm confidence that came from having faced the absolute worst the universe could offer and somehow convinced it to switch sides. "I was 8 years old when they first came to Haven's Rest," she said, her voice taking on the rhythm of a story that had been told before, though probably not to audiences this terrified. 3 of them, hunting through dimensions, looking for something interesting to devour. They found a human colony that refused to evacuate, refused to surrender, and refused to die quietly. The shadows around her moved restlessly, as if responding to the memory. "My parents were fighters, not soldiers, just stubborn colonists who didn't like being told their home was about to become someone's lunch. When the hunters started picking off the outer settlements, we didn't run. We dug in. We fought back. And when that didn't work, we tried something that had never occurred to any other species in recorded galactic history." "What?" Gorth asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. "We talked to them." The silence that followed was broken only by the Chitauri Prime Minister's continued ultrasonic panic attack. "Turns out," Elsa said, beginning to pace within the confines of the cell, "void hunters are intelligent, really intelligent. They don't just consume civilizations because they're hungry. They do it because they're bored. Do you have any idea how tedious it gets, wandering through dimensions, eating the same types of prey over and over again? Species that scream, run, hide, beg, fight briefly, then die in predictable patterns." She gestured to the shadows, which seemed to preen slightly. "But humans, we're different. We don't follow predictable patterns. We adapt, we improvise, we turn disadvantages into weapons. We're interesting. And these 3 found that fascinating enough to stick around and see what we'd do next." "So they bonded with you?" the Scales ambassador asked, his reptilian features twisted with confusion. "More like they adopted me. See, I was the first human child they'd encountered. Most species keep their young hidden when void hunters show up, quite sensibly, from their perspective. But my parents were busy fighting a war, and someone had to watch me. So I spent my time in the shelters, talking to the scary monsters in the shadows." One of the shadows moved closer to her, and Elsa reached out to touch something that wasn't quite there. Her hand disappeared up to the wrist, into what looked like empty air. "Children don't know they're supposed to be afraid of things that can end civilizations," she said softly. "I thought they were lonely." The implications of that statement hung in the air like a live grenade. By the time the fighting was over, Elsa continued, Haven's Rest had 3 new permanent residents, and I had 3 very overprotective interdimensional guardians. Turns out, when Void Hunters decide you're worth protecting, they take the job seriously. Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Red lights flashed, and the calm voice of the station's AI announced, "Alert! Hostile vessels detected approaching the station. All personnel report to designated safe zones. This is not a drill." Gorth's communicator crackled to life. "Chief, we've got problems. Long-range sensors are picking up a Crimson Hegemony battle fleet. Estimated arrival in 30 minutes. Configuration suggests they're not here for negotiations." Through the containment field, Elsa's expression shifted from casual amusement to something much more serious. Around her, the shadows began to move with predatory urgency. "Crimson Hegemony," she said quietly. "Now that's interesting. They don't usually attack neutral stations unless—" She looked up at Gorth with something that might have been sympathy. "Oh, they're here because of me, aren't they?" "What do you mean?" Gorth demanded, though part of him already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. "The Hegemony has been hunting Void Whisperers for the last 10 rotations," Elsa said, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone delivering bad news. "Apparently, they don't appreciate the idea of humans who can command interdimensional apex predators, something about it being strategically inconvenient for their expansion plans. Void Whisperers? Humans who can bond with Void Hunters. There aren't many of us, maybe 3 dozen in the entire galaxy. The Hegemony's been systematically tracking us down and eliminating us, along with anyone who might be harboring us." The color drained from Gorth's blue face, leaving him a sickly green. "You're saying they're going to attack this station because you're here?" "I'm saying they're going to attack this station because they want to make an example," Elsa corrected. "The Galactic Peace Station harboring a Void Whisperer? That sends a message they can't allow." Another announcement echoed through the station. "Hostile fleet has entered combat range. All defensive systems coming online. Evacuation protocols are now in effect." Elsa looked at the terrified faces surrounding her containment cell and sighed. "You know," she said conversationally, "this would be an excellent time to let me and my friends out of this cell. Because your conventional weapons aren't going to do much against hegemony reality disruptors, but interdimensional apex predators? They tend to take a very personal interest in people who threaten their chosen humans." The shadows around her had grown darker, more substantial, and definitely more agitated. Through the containment field, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "What are you saying?" Gorth asked, though the sinking feeling in his stomach suggested he already knew. "I'm saying," Elsa replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "that you can either keep me locked up in here and let the Hegemony turn your beautiful peace station into cosmic debris, or you can let me do what I came here to do. Which is, protect the things I care about." She gestured to the station around them. "And right now, that includes every terrified being on this station who's about to learn what happens when you threaten someone under Void Hunter protection." The shadows behind her began to shift and flow, and for just a moment, everyone in the room caught a glimpse of burning eyes and endless teeth, of predatory intelligence that spanned dimensions and regarded the approaching Hegemony fleet with the kind of interest a cat might show a particularly amusing mouse. "So," Elsa said pleasantly, "shall we discuss terms?" Haven's Rest had been the kind of colony that existed because someone had looked at a barely habitable rock orbiting a dying star and thought, "You know what this place needs? Humans." It was the sort of frontier settlement that attracted people who found the core worlds too crowded, too safe, or too interested in asking questions about their past. Elsa's parents, Marcus and Beth Thorne, had been teachers before they became colonists, and colonists before they became fighters, and fighters before they became the first humans in galactic history to successfully negotiate a peace treaty with interdimensional apex predators. Though negotiate might have been too strong a word for what had actually happened. The attack had come without warning, as Void Hunter attacks always did. One moment, Haven's Rest was a quiet agricultural colony where the biggest excitement was the annual Harvest Festival. The next, reality itself was being torn open by creatures that existed in the spaces between dimensions, hunting for something interesting to devour. Most colonies evacuated when Void Hunters appeared. The smart ones evacuated before the hunters even arrived, fleeing at the first sign of dimensional distortions. Haven's Rest, being populated largely by humans who had specifically chosen to live on a barely habitable rock in the middle of nowhere, decided that evacuation was for quitters. "We built this place," Marcus Thorne had announced to the Colony Council as dimensional rifts opened in the sky above them. "We're not leaving just because some interdimensional bullies think they can scare us off our own land." It was, objectively speaking, the kind of statement that should have resulted in the immediate extinction of the entire colony. Void Hunters didn't negotiate with their food. They didn't take prisoners. They consumed entire civilizations as casually as most beings ate lunch, leaving behind nothing but empty space and the occasional warning beacon for other species to avoid the area. But Haven's Rest had something most colonies didn't. 8-year-old Elsa Thorne, who had inherited her parents' stubborn streak, along with their complete inability to recognize when something was obviously impossible. The first Void Hunter had materialized in the colony's central square during what the colonists would later refer to as the 26-hour siege. It was a creature of living shadow and burning starlight, roughly the size of a shuttlecraft, but shaped like nothing that had ever evolved in normal space. It moved through dimensions the way most beings moved through air, phasing in and out of reality with predatory grace. Most of the colonists had barricaded themselves in the reinforced shelters, manning defensive positions and firing weapons that did absolutely nothing to creatures that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But Elsa, who had been left in the main shelter while her parents coordinated the defense, had gotten bored. Boredom, in the case of an 8-year-old human, was apparently more dangerous than interdimensional apex predators. She had slipped out of the shelter through a maintenance hatch that the adults had forgotten to secure, drawn by curiosity about the pretty lights she could see through the small windows. By the time anyone noticed she was missing, she was already sitting cross-legged in the central square, approximately 3 meters away from something that could have erased her from existence with a casual thought. "Hello," she had said politely, because her parents had raised her to be courteous to strangers. "Are you lost?" The Void Hunter had stopped moving. This was, according to every xenobiologist who later studied the incident, impossible. Void Hunters didn't stop. They didn't pause. They certainly didn't engage in conversation with their intended prey. But there it was, frozen in mid-phase, its burning eyes fixed on a small human child who was treating it like a lost pet. "My name's Elsa," she had continued, apparently unaware that she was addressing something that had personally ended at least 14 different civilizations. "What's your name?" The Void Hunter had tilted what might generously be called its head, studying her with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for particularly complex mathematical equations. When it finally moved, it was to settle into a position that mirrored her own cross-legged pose, though given its lack of anything resembling legs, the effect was more like watching a thundercloud try to sit down. "You don't have a name, do you?" Elsa had asked, with the matter-of-fact tone that children used when stating obvious truths. "That's sad. Everyone should have a name." What happened next depended on whose version of the story you believed. According to the official colony records, there had been a brief exchange of non-verbal communication between the child and the Void Hunter. According to Elsa's parents, their daughter had somehow convinced an interdimensional apex predator to play 20 questions. According to Elsa herself, she had simply asked the creature why it was so angry all the time. The truth, as it often was with humans, was probably more complicated than any of the official versions. What everyone agreed on was that by the time Marcus and Beth Thorne had fought their way through 3 blocks of war zone to reach their daughter, they found her engaged in what could only be described as a conversation with something that shouldn't have been capable of conversation. She was gesturing animatedly, the way children did when explaining something very important, while the Void Hunter listened with the patience of a creature that had all the time in the universe. "Elsa," Marcus had called out, trying to keep his voice calm while internally calculating how quickly he could reach her before the creature decided to resume its meal. "Come here, sweetheart." "Just a minute, Daddy." she had replied without looking away from the Void Hunter. I'm explaining about friendship. Friendship, Beth had repeated faintly. Uh-huh. See? They don't understand why people always run away from them. They think maybe they're doing something wrong, but they don't know what. So they keep trying the same thing over and over, hoping someone will finally explain the rules. The Void Hunter had made a sound like distant thunder mixed with cosmic background radiation. Somehow, impossibly, it had sounded sad. They're lonely, Elsa had announced, as if this solved everything. They've been lonely for a really, really long time. What followed was 3 hours of the most surreal hostage negotiation in galactic history, conducted between two human teachers and an interdimensional apex predator through the translation services of their 8-year-old daughter. By the end of it, Haven's Rest had become the first human colony to successfully establish diplomatic relations with beings that most of the galaxy considered forces of nature rather than intelligent entities. The other two Void Hunters had arrived to find their packmate engaged in what appeared to be a complex discussion about agricultural techniques and crop rotation schedules. Rather than resuming their attack, they had settled down to listen, drawn by the novelty of prey that didn't immediately try to kill them or run away, screaming. They want to know if they can stay, Elsa had explained to her parents after another hour of incomprehensible communication. They promise to be good neighbors. Stay? Marcus had asked weakly. They like it here. It's quiet, and nobody shoots at them for no reason. And I told them about movie night on Fridays. They've never seen movies before. And that was how Haven's Rest became the only human colony in the galaxy, with 3 Void Hunters in permanent residence, serving as a combination neighborhood watch and interdimensional pest control service. They kept to themselves mostly, manifesting only when needed, but their presence had turned the colony into one of the safest places in human space. It had also turned young Elsa Thorne into something that had never existed before, a human who could communicate with beings that existed outside normal space-time, who could understand motivations that spanned dimensions, and who had somehow convinced apex predators to adopt her as family. The first Void Whisperer. Back in the present, the Galactic Peace Station shuddered as the Crimson Hegemony Fleet opened fire. Their reality disruptor weapons tore through conventional shields like tissue paper, sending waves of distorted spacetime rippling through the station's superstructure. Shields at 60% and falling, came the announcement over the station's communication system. All defensive platforms are engaging the enemy fleet. In the holding cell, Elsa stood with her eyes closed, one hand pressed against the containment field. Around her, the shadows writhed with barely contained fury. The temperature in the room had dropped to the point where everyone's breath was visible, and the lights flickered as energy that shouldn't exist interfered with the station's power grid. They're angry, she said quietly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of something that made everyone present suddenly remember what it felt like to be prey. They really don't like it when people shoot at things they're protecting. Another impact shook the station. Emergency lighting activated as main power fluctuated. Shields at 30%, the announcement continued. Hull breaches on levels 15 through 20. Emergency crews responding. Gorth looked at the containment field controls, then at Elsa, then at the shadows that were becoming more solid and more obviously predatory with each passing second. If I release you, he said slowly, what exactly are you planning to do? Elsa opened her eyes, and for just a moment, they reflected light like a nocturnal predator's. I'm going to introduce the Crimson Hegemony to the concept of consequences, she said, with a smile that was all teeth. They want to hunt Void Whisperers? Fine, but they should probably understand what they're actually hunting first. The shadows behind her moved with liquid anticipation, and somewhere in the depth of space, reality began to tear open along lines that had never existed before. The containment field died with a sound like reality hiccuping. Gorth had barely touched the release controls when the energy barrier simply stopped existing. Not deactivated, not powered down. It ceased to be, as if the universe had suddenly forgotten it was supposed to be there. The shadows that had been contained behind transparent aluminum flowed out like liquid starlight, expanding to fill the room with presence that made everyone's primitive brain stem start screaming warnings about things with too many teeth. Thank you, Elsa said politely, stepping out of the cell as if she'd just been released from a particularly boring meeting. "I do appreciate reasonable people." Around her, the shadows began to take shape. Not fully solid, they still existed primarily in dimensions that standard physics pretended didn't exist, but substantial enough that everyone in the room could see exactly what had been lurking just outside their peripheral vision for the past 6 hours. The Chitauri Prime Minister made a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. "Oh, don't be dramatic," Elsa said, though whether she was addressing the Prime Minister or the Void Hunters was unclear. "We're all professionals here." The station shuddered again as another wave of reality disruptor fire struck home. Through the security center's main display, they could see the Crimson Hegemony fleet in all its terrible glory. 36 ships arranged in a perfect hunter-killer formation, their weapons tearing holes in space-time itself. "Shields down to 15%, announced the station's AI, with the sort of calm that suggested it had already calculated the precise moment when everyone aboard would die horribly. "Multiple hull breaches detected. Evacuation pods are launching." "How many people are still on the station?" Elsa asked, her tone suddenly businesslike. "Approximately 1.8 million, Gorth replied automatically, then paused to consider the surreal nature of briefing an interdimensional asset on casualty projections. "Most of the diplomatic quarter has evacuated, but the civilian sectors are full of families with children who can't move fast enough to outrun a hegemony hunter fleet," Elsa finished. She looked up at the tactical display, her expression shifting to something that would have looked perfectly normal on the face of a military strategist. "Standard hegemony tactic: disable the station's mobility, prevent evacuation, then take their time picking apart the hull until everyone inside dies, slowly enough to make an example." The shadows around her had grown larger, more restless. The room's temperature continued to drop, and frost was beginning to form on the surfaces of their monitoring equipment. "The thing about interdimensional apex predators," Elsa continued conversationally, "is that they don't really distinguish between acceptable losses and personal insults. When someone threatens their territory," she gestured to the station around them, "they tend to take it rather personally." "This isn't your territory," the Scales ambassador pointed out, though his voice had the strained quality of someone trying to maintain rational thought while standing next to things that made rational thought seem suddenly inadequate. "Isn't it?" Elsa asked. "I'm here. My family is here. That makes this place mine to protect." She paused, considering. "Besides, the hegemony fired first. That makes this self-defense." On the tactical display, the lead hegemony dreadnought was moving into position for what military analysts would later classify as a systematic disassembly maneuver, a technique designed to take apart large space stations piece by piece while maximizing psychological impact on the victims. Elsa watched for a moment, then sighed. "Right then," she said, cracking her knuckles like someone preparing for a mildly strenuous workout. "Time to go to work." She closed her eyes and did something that didn't have a name in any known language. It wasn't telepathy. Telepathy required thoughts, and what passed between Elsa and the Void Hunters existed in the spaces between thoughts. It wasn't command. You couldn't command apex predators any more than you could command a hurricane. It was more like conversation. Like family members who had known each other so long that they could communicate entire concepts with a glance. The shadows around her suddenly snapped into perfect focus, revealing 3 creatures that violated several fundamental laws of physics just by existing. They were beautiful the way that supernovas were beautiful. Terrible, awe-inspiring, and capable of ending everything you'd ever known without breaking a sweat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elsa announced to the room at large, "meet the family. That's Harbinger." She gestured to the largest of the 3, a creature of flowing darkness and burning stars that seemed to exist in at least 6 dimensions simultaneously. "Eclipse," she indicated the second, whose form shifted between solid matter and pure energy in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "And Whisper," she finished, nodding toward the third, which appeared to be made of crystallized space-time and predatory intent. The 3 Void Hunters regarded the terrified aliens in the room with the sort of polite interest that cats showed to mice who had just wandered into their territory. "Now," Elsa said, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining a very simple concept to very slow students, The Crimson Hegemony has made a serious error in judgment. They've attacked a station under my protection, threatened approximately 1.8 million innocent beings, and—" her voice hardened. "They've been systematically hunting my people across the galaxy." She opened her eyes, and they reflected light like polished mirrors. "I think it's time someone taught them about consequences." What happened next would be studied by military strategists, xenobiologists, and physicists for the next 3 centuries, though none of them would ever quite agree on what they'd actually witnessed. The Void Hunters didn't travel to the Hegemony fleet. They simply stopped being in the security center and started being in the space around the enemy ships. Reality bent around them like taffy, creating impossible geometries that made the station's sensors give up and display error messages in languages that hadn't been invented yet. The Hegemony's reality disruptor weapons, designed to tear apart anything from starship hulls to planetary crusts, struck the Void Hunters and stopped. Not deflected, not absorbed. They simply ceased to exist, as if the universe had decided that energy weapons were a quaint but ultimately pointless concept. "You see," Elsa explained to her terrified audience, "most species think of Void Hunters as forces of nature. Unstoppable, incomprehensible, inevitable. But they're not forces of nature. They're apex predators. And apex predators are very, very territorial." On the tactical display, the Hegemony fleet was discovering what it meant to be prey. The Void Hunters moved through space like living storms, phasing in and out of dimensions that the Hegemony's sensors couldn't even detect. They didn't attack the ships so much as they edited them out of existence, reaching through multiple layers of reality to target structural components that existed in normal space-time. 36 ships became 35, then 30, then 20, with no visible weapons fire and no apparent means of defense. "The beautiful thing about interdimensional warfare," Elsa continued, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone watching a plan come together, "is that you can't fight what you can't understand. And the Hegemony, for all their technological advancement, never bothered to study their enemy." The remaining Hegemony ships were trying to retreat, their formation dissolving into chaos as reality itself seemed to turn against them. But you couldn't outrun creatures that existed outside normal space-time any more than you could outrun your own shadow. Within minutes, the pride of the Crimson Hegemony fleet had been reduced to cosmic debris and rapidly expanding gas clouds. "There," Elsa said with satisfaction. "Problem solved." The room was silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the faint sound of the Chithari Prime Minister's continued nervous breakdown. "Ms. Thorne," Gorth said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "what exactly just happened?" "The Hegemony learned an important lesson about picking on things under Void Hunter protection," Elsa replied, "though I doubt they'll live long enough to benefit from the experience." She looked around the room at the various alien officials, all of whom were staring at her with expressions that ranged from terror to awe to something that might have been religious conversion. "Now then," she said brightly, "I believe we were supposed to discuss trade agreements with the Antaran Collective. I do hope this little interruption hasn't put anyone off their lunch." The shadows around her purred contentedly, settling back into their usual positions just outside normal perception. The crisis was over, the threat had been neutralized, and the galaxy had just received a very clear message about what happened when you threatened humanity's extended family. Somewhere in the depths of space, other Void Whisperers felt the resonance of the battle and smiled. The Neighborhood Watch was alive and well, and the Crimson Hegemony had just learned why you didn't mess with humanity's backyard. Elsa Thorne, junior trade attaché and interdimensional diplomat, straightened her jacket and prepared to get back to the perfectly ordinary business of negotiating agricultural export quotas. After all, someone had to keep the galaxy running.